Do you see any potential constitutional conflicts in any of these amendments that we might pass here in Missouri?
Well, the interesting thing about it is that there's a whole lot of things that are being proposed to go into the Constitution, which is already kind of a mess because it has been amended, various things every other year. Every time we have an election, we have propositions to amend it.
And why is that? Is it easier to get the people to do that than to pass a bill?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in part it is. It also, the Constitution restricts the ability of the legislature or local governments to pass things that are contrary to what's in the Constitution. So we put a lot of things in the Constitution. And because the governor has the power to decide which election the vote is going to be held, Governor Nixon has, and we upheld that right in 2004 with the anti-gay marriage amendment when I was on the Supreme Court. So Governor Nixon has the power to decide which of these things is going to be in August and which in November. And it's an interesting lineup that we have because we have the right to farm and the right to bear arms. Those are things that people might be putting on the ballot in part to drive turnout of voters who would be for them.
So so can you say something is more or less, is it easier to pass something in August than it is November, for instance?
Well, I'm not sure. It'll drive up the turnout of people who are gun rights people. It'll drive the turnout for people who are concerned about the right to farm issues, which really goes back to the puppy mill question of 2010. And so you'll have more of those voters at the polls. That may, by the way, affect things like a county executive's race, because you may have more voters that have a conservative bent. I mean, obviously, I think the governor, being a Democrat, probably wanted some of those issues in August and leave the other things for November. The transportation tax, for example, as was discussed, he's against that. And I think that having that very short cycle for a campaign may disadvantage that proposition a little bit. But that's his choice, and it's a political choice that's enshrined in the Constitution.
So much strategy
it is.
For an
that's
election
right.
that a lot of people might even forget about, unfortunately.
That's before you even get to the substance of it, because you do have something that may, in the right to farm, negate state legislation or local legislation about confinement of animals, about use of pesticides, use of whatever. So that might, or even foreign ownership of farms. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there that we may not completely understand. The right to bear arms proposition would probably, because the chiefs of police, I think of Kansas City and St. Louis, are wary of it, because it may restrict their local options in terms of controlling guns on the streets of the urban areas. In the transportation tax, there is a prohibition. While that sales tax is in effect, there's a prohibition on raising the gasoline tax, and there's a prohibition on tolls for toll roads and toll bridges. So these things are put in the Constitution to control future legislative action. That's why they're in the Constitution, rather than just having the people vote on them as statutes or laws that they pass.
We'll talk more about the Farm Bill in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about the gun amendment first. How different is it from the Second Amendment at the federal level?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things about it. One is, and this is maybe a sidelight, I'm not sure what it means, because the Second Amendment does apply to protecting the private ownership and use of guns. And there are some things, felons, and there's a federal statute that keeps felons from having guns. There are restrictions in law about people with mental illnesses, and so that's an exception in there. But it calls the right to bear arms unalienable, which is a word that was used in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, referring really to rights that the government cannot touch because they're given to us by our Creator. And so they really have, in this proposition, pushed that even to a higher level. But also the questions might come up about whether federal laws that are inconsistent with this proposition ought to be enforced in Missouri. Well, the Supremacy Clause says that the federal law is supreme, but at the local level, it may restrict the ability of localities to regulate the possession and use of firearms in a locality.
Our our legislature is controlled by Republicans. Would you describe this list of amendments, this ballot, as conservative in its agenda?
I think a couple of them are. Obviously, the transportation tax doesn't necessarily come from that place. There's a proposition on there about protecting your data and your cell phone and all those kinds of things. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on that and has included that in the protections of the Fourth Amendment. But one of the things it may be redundant, it may be not needed, but on the other hand, I think that there might be a good development in that there are some really serious protections for individual rights in the Missouri Constitution. And the courts really never pay that much attention to them because everybody litigates those issues under the federal Constitution. So maybe a focus on the state Constitution for those things isn't bad. But on the other hand, you're also cluttering up the state Constitution with a lot of things that really have very little to do with the Constitution as such.
Okay, so if they are perhaps redundant in some cases, is there something more to read into this? Is there some sort of pushback against the federal government from our state legislature that they would like to see our state do here?
There might be some of that. They had a bill that would have made it a crime for a federal official to enforce federal law that was against state law. That didn't pass.
That wouldn't hold up too well at the federal level.
No, it wouldn't. But the thing is that litigation carries a cost, so the question is, do we understand everything, all of the implications of this? No. That's when you pass something and put it in the Constitution, you're probably going to have courts decide, well, does this apply? Does this negate this other provision? Does it negate some regulation? In the farm thing, does it negate the bill that was done in 2011 about puppy? You know, they had the puppy.
B.
The Proposition B, but then the legislature changed Proposition B because Proposition B was a law. It wasn't a constitutional amendment. So they changed that law and they had the deal struck. But is that all invalid if you pass the right to farm? I don't know.
If you don't know, I'm not sure who does.
Well, if there's 3 other judges and 4 judges that say, maybe you'll know.
Critique us for a second as a state on our trajectory that we're on here in terms of good lawmaking. And I don't necessarily mean whether or not you agree with the laws, but are we efficient in our state legislature? Are these the issues that are most important, do you think, to our economy, to our livelihood here in Missouri?
I tend to doubt it. One of the things that I've noticed is that since term limits came fully into effect, that more and more interest groups are interested in using the initiative and if they can get it through the legislature, the referendum. Sometimes you use the referendum because you've got a governor who will veto your legislation, and so you'll take it to the people, and that's been true for quite some time. But I think there's more things that are going to the ballot than, say, 10 years ago before term limits fully kicked in. And so I think what we lose in that prospect is legislating, which is, I think, in some terms, an art of bringing people together and taking off the rough edges. If I can just go through the initiative process, I get to write a whole bunch of stuff in there, and as long as I describe it in 50 or 100 words and people vote for it, then it's fine. But who reads that? I mean, in the legislative process, you do have contending interest groups that will read it and shape it, and one would hope compromise about things. So I think the quality of legislating goes down when you start using the ballot too much. And I think the use of the propositions to drive voter turnout for one party or the other, and by the way, both parties have done this. I'm not making a comment about Republicans. I mean, you can put something on the ballot about minimum wage and drive up a Democratic turnout too. So, but I don't think that enhances the cohesion of our law, of the, how it all kind of hangs together. I think we're going to have a lot of loose ends. The Constitution of Missouri is already about 10 times longer than the U.S. Constitution. It's getting about as long as War and Peace. So, I mean, we've got to stop at some point. So what it tells you, I think, is that maybe the voters should say, well, prove to me that we really need this. And maybe we should vote no unless the proponents of this prove to us that we really need this in the Constitution.